There we go. Welcome, everybody. It is so good to have so many of you with us. We've got pretty good geographic representation here, which is really exciting. My name is Kyle White. I'm the Director of Education here at Co-operatives First. And Co-operatives First, for those who might not be familiar, we're a nonprofit organization based in Saskatchewan, and we work across all of Western Canada, raising awareness of cooperative businesses and providing supports to groups that are starting their own co-ops. I recognize a couple of names and faces, but I'd love to know where everyone's joining us from. So please, in the chat, if you could drop your name, where you're joining us from, and what you do for a living, it'd be great to see where we've got folks joining from. So please, your name, where you're from, and what you do for a living in the chat. That's much appreciated. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which is located on Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homelands of the Métis. I recognize we're joined by people from all across Turtle Island, so I invite you to acknowledge the ancestors and the peoples of the place that you call home. Today, we're really excited to be talking about business planning, and in particular, what do lenders look for in your business plan? And we're excited for this webinar because we're also happy to announce the launch of Co-operatives First's latest resource, the Biz Plan Generator. This resource was created with funding from our partner, Vancity Credit Union, and it's an online resource that provides free business planning support that allows users to create a personalized business plan, offering helpful prompts, resources, and supports to groups as they go through the business planning process. The Biz Plan Generator saves your progress so you can work on your business plan as time permits and come back to it later. Once you've completed your business plan, you can download a custom stylized PDF of your plan that's ready to submit to a lender, a partner, or an investor. With our Business Plan Generator, business planning is easier than ever. We'll drop a link to the Biz Plan Generator in the chat, and we'll be sure to send out a link to the Biz Plan Generator to everyone that's signed up for the webinar. We're extremely grateful to our partner, Vancity Credit Union, for their support in creating this new resource. And to help entrepreneurs, community leaders, economic development professionals with their business planning, we're joined today by Brian Cade. Brian's the Community Investment Manager at Vancity Credit Union, and Brian's joining us to share some insights into what lenders look for in a business plan to help you get started. If you have any questions for Brian, please drop them in the chat, and we may have some time during the webinar, but we'll also have some time at the end for a Q&A. Brian, thank you so much for joining us. Over to you.
Good morning, folks. Very nice to virtually see some of you and know that the rest of you are there in the ether. Very happy to be here. And I wanted to just first say that I was joking with Kyle before we got everybody on the call here that I pulled a last minute wardrobe change. So I hope you don't mind my casual attire, because Kyle was very kind as a gift to send to me one of their new sweatshirts. And so supporting Co-operatives First here today quite happily, and cozy as well, which is really great. So yeah, as Kyle mentioned, I am with Vancity Credit Union. I've been with the credit union now for longer than I care to admit almost. It's coming a little over 18 years actually now, and I've had many different roles with the credit union over that time, but almost exclusively working with a combination of our not-for-profit, co-op, and small business members throughout that time. And so our intention in that work is that we are a community-based credit union, and always a good reminder, because it's often forgotten, that credit unions are cooperatives too. And in fact, we very much lead with our cooperative values as a member-owned institution and very much a community-based organization. And so it really behooves us to make sure that, you know, we want to make sure that our communities thrive, and that happens when small business, cooperatives, and not-for-profit sector are all thriving in our communities. And so it really is really important to us. So with that, what we want to talk to you folks today a little bit about is kind of what we as bankers look for in financing for small business and co-ops or also for not-for-profits when they have kind of a more of a revenue-based model. So I may use the term business and co-op a little interchangeably here today. So maybe just as a clarifying feature, a lot of the times when what we're talking about today will have to do with any of those types of organizations, whether you're co-op, small business, or not-for-profit, when you're looking to borrow money, getting a loan for your organization, and when, for the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part, if your organization, your co-op, has a revenue-based model that sort of requires you to be doing something that is acting like a business. You're not just purely seeking grants. Or for instance, if you are a housing co-op, we could look at it similarly, but this is more for business-focused enterprises in the co-op model. So give me a moment to make sure I properly share my screen here, and we'll pull up a slide deck. As Kyle mentioned, you're more than welcome to ask questions throughout, so pop them in the chat, and Kyle will quite happily interrupt me for those questions so that we can get to them before moving on and everybody feeling like they're lost. So if I can just confirm with a thumbs up, maybe from Kyle, that you can see my screen, my shared screen, I should say. Great. Okay. All right. It's always a juggling act with lots. So for startup foundations, what we want to think about here is, what is it that the top 10 things that we as lenders might be looking for from you as a representative of your co-op when you're looking for financing? And so keep in mind that there are some differences here, but typically what we're talking about today are generally the sorts of things that you'll probably find is true across almost all financial institutions to some degree or another. What I will tell you a little bit about, sprinkling through our conversation today, will be the idea that for financing for organizations, either in the startup or early growth phase, is really what we're leaning on here. And so that some of the requirements are different than what you might find for existing, really well-established businesses or co-ops or even not-for-profits. And so if you've had experience in the past getting a business loan for your co-op or your business, and you've done it a little differently than this, feel free to ask questions, but know that we're taking a bit of a lens here of organizations that are really very much in that early stage. Either you haven't even started yet, or you're so early that you don't have much of a track record yet. So happy to clarify that with any clarifying questions as we go, but keep that in mind very much. So I may, for fun, ask you guys to answer one or two little quizzes here to pop into the chat. So I'll have to make sure we got the chat open here. But true or false, maybe as you can really quickly, have a look at these questions. Getting financed for a startup with less than 2 years of operation can be a challenge. True or false? And to get a loan for a startup, do you need to prepare a business plan? Throw your answers in the chat as you can. And now I need to learn how to reopen the chat, Kyle, because as I share my screen, it disappears. Where did that go? Let's see here. Maybe chat. Kyle, what do you see in there in the chat? Sorry.
I'm seeing probably 4 trues, 1 true, 1 false. False for the first, true for the second, true times 2. Mostly true for both. Mostly
true. Yeah. Getting financing for a startup with less than 2 years of operation can be a challenge. Traditional financing typically is sort of looking in the rear view mirror, looking into the past, meaning that if you don't have at least a couple years of financial track record to show that your organization can afford the loan payments that you're looking to take on, then it becomes real problematic, right? It's a good analogy would be trying to get a personal loan or a mortgage without having had any employment for the last 2 years. You may have just got a job, and that's great, but your financial institution might be a little hesitant, knowing that you just started that job and not sure whether you're going to be able to stick with it, or maybe you're on probation, all those reasons. So similar with the business, if you haven't got a track record to prove those financials and your ability to repay a loan, it can be a real challenge, which is why it's also true that having a business plan for a startup loan for those specific types of loan programs is also often really critical, because you don't have anything else to show for it. You don't have that historical track record to prove those sources of regular reoccurring income yet. So both are true. So now that you know this, you're thinking, what do I need to do to prepare for my meeting with a lender if I'm going to do that? Well, you want to ideally be able to anticipate some of their expectations. Partly, we will have a really good handling on that by the end of the session today, which is great. So you're already off to the races. You want to know what kind of documents you might want to bring. And so you can assume that for startup financing, it's very likely that a business plan and cash flow projections are going to be required. And so you want to make sure that you've prepared some of that, but kind of goes without saying, you want to check with them first, right? But ideally, showing up more prepared will not waste your time and not waste their time. I'm not too fussed about whether or not you waste a lender's time, but you're going to get off on the right foot if you're not wasting your own time by coming prepared and making sure that you can actually get a fruitful meeting out of that conversation. And then, of course, you want to prepare your own questions for the lender, which we can talk a little bit more at the end of the presentation about what those might be. And then what their expectations might be of you, just as a highlight here before we get really into the weeds, is that you have some kind of relevant experience. So as a leader or a representative of your co-op, you want to make sure that you and your team are bringing some relevant experience to what you're undertaking, that if you're selling a product or a service specifically, that through that work, you've got a pretty good knowledge of what that is and how that market works. And we're going to talk a lot more about what that looks like. And that includes having a very well-researched business plan. And so we'll dive into that a little bit more too. Okay, just for fun, one more quick quiz. Which of the following documents, if you were applying for a startup or early stage loan, do you think your lender might ask for when you're coming in to represent your co-op? What are we seeing, Kyle? Any answers there?
Nothing yet.
All right. Okay.
Maybe a few things to type out.
Any guesses? I'll give you a hint. It's not all of them.
Biz Plan, cash flow, market research. Someone said all of them. Someone said most likely cash flow.
Yeah. Very good. Yeah. So especially if you're representing a co-op early stage, you're probably going to look at specifically a business plan and cash flow and market research. Now, I will talk to you guys a little bit later about where the lines blur between the organization that you're representing, your co-op, and you yourselves as members and very likely directors on the board, and what that means for you in terms of what you might bring and represent as personal guarantees. So we'll get to that later. That's where things can start to muddy a bit in terms of what may or may not be required. So, all right. What are the 10 things that we lenders might be looking for specifically from your startup organization? Let's dive right in. I'm going to skip that because that's just a teaser anyways. And I'm going to let you guys off the hook with this one. I'm going to tell you the answers right away. So is it good to ask for a bit more money than you think you might need just to be on the safe side? And should you be able to describe your business in under 1 minute such that anyone can understand it? Now, the first one I actually think might be the hardest question we've had so far, because you might instinctually think, yeah, that sounds prudent. I should ask for a little bit more money than I need just in case. The real answer is it's kind of false, because what we would rather you do is ask for the exact amount of money that you need. And if that includes some working capital, which you might consider to be just on the safe side, that you do that in a very specific way. And we will talk about that a little bit more in our cash flow projections. But the idea being there, if you've identified a need for some extra working capital, and working capital we usually mean is like access to a little bit of extra cash or an overdraft in case you have a slow month, that we have identified exactly what that need is. We've not just said, it would be nice to have an extra 10 grand if we could have it for a rainy day. Let's identify exactly what amount of funds you need and be very precise about that. And yes, true. Number two, you should very much be able to understand sort of the business venture that the co-op is going to undertake in under a minute. We should be able to understand who you are, meaning we are a co-op, we are member owned, we are made up of the following community. Our intention is to do the following activities and generate income by doing X, Y, and Z. And our customers will be the following. Will they be folks that walk into our store? Will they be folks that find us online? Will they be exclusively in our community, or will we take a broader reach? And so being able to describe that really quickly is really important. I say that because you you'd be surprised to hear how many times we've heard pitches from folks, and we don't fully understand the business, and it takes a lot of work. And even then reading the business plan, we still don't fully understand the business. So I encourage you to not make assumptions and make sure that you really think about how to be clear and concise when you talk about your business so that folks can follow along really easily. So those are good ones to be thoughtful of. Now, number one of our top 10 things, as we sort of hinted to in that first quiz question just there, your financing request. How much money do you need? Not how much you want. And so a really critical thing to do here is think about how you will use that money. And so when you're making your plans, you're going to be doing a couple things. You're going to be doing ideally a business plan and cash flow projections. But as part of that, you're going to be doing a very specific budget. Either if you're in startup, then we would call it your startup budget, all the money you need and all the things you need to purchase or have on hand before you sort of hit go, if that makes sense. And so I sometimes joke, it's almost like if you were running a 100-meter sprint in the Olympics, right? You need to get everything ready before you get to the start line. You need to have your track shoes on, you need to have your uniform on, you need to stretch and warm up. Those are all the things you do before you start. And then when the starter's gun goes, then you're operating and you're out there in the wild. And so before the starter's gun goes, what do you need? And so we're going to be really specific about that. We effectively want to know where every single dollar is going to go, which means if it's going to things like equipment, then we want to see like very specific costing on that. And we might even ask for quotes on what those things are going to cost, so we know for sure that we're fully funding you for those. If it's for inventory, again, ideally knowing exactly what you need to purchase, how much of it, and what that cost will be, including all the extra fees for taxes and delivery. And then, as I mentioned before, if we need some working capital, we'll talk about how you work that out, but exactly how much and why, how you will use that. And so it's really critical to have that sorted out. And the reality is, it's easy for me to say this because I think I'm a nice, friendly guy. As a banker, we want to be your friend. So we actually really want you to succeed. So I would stress, do not think about this part of your conversation with your lender as a negotiation. Think of this as something that you want to go into with a teamwork. And I say this as an intentional pun, as a cooperative approach to building out what your funding need is. And so if your banker does not agree with you, then one of two things: either they don't understand what you're doing, and so you either need to just make sure that you reset that conversation, or maybe you need to find a new lender, which we'll talk about later. Or you actually just need to fully understand what their concerns around the risk might be and what alternatives you have. And so there may be a situation where you go, there's some nice to haves on our budget list to get started, and there are some must haves. And be really clear about that. Your lender does not want to underfund you, right? We want you to succeed. We want the cooperative that you're starting or you're growing to be successful, not only because I think lenders like Vancity Credit Union and Community Futures and other credit unions across the country truly want to see small business, small cooperatives emerge and grow and thrive. That is our desire. And so we want to make sure you're fully funded, but we also want to make sure you're not overfunded, because we know better than anyone else that too much debt, especially early on, becomes a real burden for the organization and for your opportunity to succeed. And so making sure that we haven't overfunded you with too much burden is really, really important as well. So that's why finding that really sweet spot is so very critical. All right. Now, number two, we alluded to this also in the quiz a little bit, your business description. So we want to know quite clearly what you are doing. I have heard so many pitches that I told you a moment ago where it was not clear what the business was selling. It was not clear who the customers were for the business, or where they would find those customers, and what your success looks like. A recent pitch I heard was for an online marketing firm who would provide all types of social media production services to basically help their business community succeed. And so what does that really mean? Like what are their services that they're actually providing? What are the costs? And who are their clients? Who are they seeking out? So when I say who, you might be thinking about both geographically. Are we serving a customer base or a client base that are in our service area, meaning like places that we can easily, walk or drive to or ride your bike to, or is this an online service or a consulting service whereby you could actually work with folks from all across the country, maybe even internationally. It could be a whole bunch of different things. I'll give you two really good examples. I hope they don't mind me speaking about them, but some of our favorite co-ops that we've had for years, working out of the Vancouver area. One is a group called Sustainability Solutions. They're a consulting firm. They do consulting to municipalities and cities and governments. There are a bunch of professionals that are actually they themselves spread across the country. Their service area is kind of anywhere in the English and French speaking world, because they are bilingual and they work remotely. And so they can service those areas. Now, if you're going to say that the entire world is your service area, you're going to want to start being a little bit more thoughtful about how you're going to find your clients, because that's a pretty broad reach. But compare that to another favorite co-op of ours, which is the Shift Delivery Co-op. They run cargo trikes with big boxes on the back, huge boxes on the back of their cargo trikes. And they do kind of last mile delivery service within the core of Vancouver. And so their client base is very clearly their geographic service area. If they have a client, even a client out in the outskirts of Greater Vancouver, it doesn't work for them. It has to be in their service area where they can go from their warehouse and then delivery typically in the downtown core of Vancouver. So being able to clearly articulate how your business works, those kinds of details really, really, really matter. So being able to describe that, think of it like an elevator pitch and try it out with folks and make sure they understand what you're doing. I would literally say, if you can try out your pitches with folks that haven't heard about what your plans are in detail, and then have them tell you back what they heard. That will really tell you if they understood what you're up to and what you're doing. I think it's a great exercise in preparing for meeting with your lender, but realistically, it's a great exercise just to have done for your marketing and being able to describe what your organization is for, right? Every opportunity you have to talk to folks about what you're doing is really a marketing opportunity beyond just talking to your lender. And you want folks walking away from that going, that's really interesting. I understand fully what it is they were talking about. I understand how it might apply to me as a potential customer, or maybe depending on what you're doing as a potential member in the future even. And I get it. I can walk away, and then actually I can be your advocate, because through word of mouth, I can tell you what those folks are doing. So really, really critical. Number 3, your expertise. So we don't, as lenders, expect you all as leaders of your organization to be experts in every facet of running an organization or a business. Not at all. But we do expect that your expertise brings some strength to the organization if you're seeking to borrow for your cooperative, which means that we want to know that the folks that are running your cooperative, or more specifically running and ideally working in, actually have some skills that they're bringing that are going to make that organization more likely to succeed. So you may not have specific skills in marketing or sales, or you may not have specific skills in finance. But what you can do is also speak to whether or not you have sort of an advisory group or coaches, even folks here at Cooperatives First. How is it that you're leaning on the skills of people outside of your organization to really shore up where your weaknesses are? And don't be afraid to call them out, because as I said, we don't actually expect you to be experts in everything. So call out where your strengths are and call out where your weaknesses are, and then where you're going to seek help for that. And so whether it's formal organizations like Cooperatives First, or whether it's quite literally just people who said, listen, when you're getting around to do your books at the end of the year, I'll give you a hand, or I'll help you out. That's great. Like hold on to those names and stick with it, because it's really, really important that you be able to identify that. And so what's very common when people are putting together, say, a business plan or just a loan application and speaking to the strengths of their organization, is they will do that. They will talk about the strengths of their board and the folks working in the organization. And then they'll speak to what they'll call their advisory group. Now, between you and me, a lot of people like to call it advisory groups. It makes it sound nice and formal, as if the group comes together once a month and sits around a big fancy boardroom table and discusses the future of the organization. You can call it that, and it doesn't have to be that formal. It just has to be folks that will pick up the phone when you call and will ideally give you 10, 15 minutes, an hour of their time every once in a while to help you with those shortfalls and those shortcomings that you have. And then further to that, if in a co-op, it could be members that are not necessarily on the board, but that are willing to participate when they're needed. Or if you've hired staff that bring extra skills to your organization, that's great too. So all those things are really great. Okay. I'm doing a lot of talking here, Kyle. We just finished number 3, so I'm going to take a deep breath, double check if we've had any questions come in.
No questions yet. You're answering everything.
None as yet. Okay. So then just a friendly reminder, folks, I'm happy to slow down and pause on any one of these. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ping us in the chat. Okay. Number 4. We're getting into the meat of this here, or the tofu for those vegetarians here. So what is your financial plan and why is this so important? Well, your financial plan might arguably be the most important thing here. And so why isn't it number 1 on our list? Well, partly because we're kind of going in an order of operations here about how you might think of how you're putting these things together, and partly because we didn't want to overwhelm you right at the beginning of this talk. But it probably is the most important part of this. When I look at lending opportunities, when I look at applications for financing on our end, I will typically read the first page of a business plan so I know what's going on, because that first page, that executive summary of a business plan, is kind of like your elevator pitch just written down. And then I will turn what is usually to the back and go immediately to the financial plan, because numbers tell a whole story onto themselves. So it is super important, A, to have a financial plan, and B, to have put quite a lot of thought into this, and so that you're really ready for it. And so we'll talk about this in 2 pieces. Your financial plan being mostly around like the startup costs and your equity contribution, and sort of how that fits into your long-term anticipated expenses and revenues. And in a moment, we'll talk about your cash flow projections and what that looks like. And so I did allude to this a little bit earlier, and that was intentionally, because sometimes we want to really make sure that these things stick about how important they are. Your startup costs, advertising, your rent or your lease of a space, the equipment that you might need to purchase, any actual improvements, renovations you might need to do to the space that you're leasing, having quotes and or invoices for those, any initial legal fees you might need to do to incorporate the co-op and get it all set up, inventory, if that's a factor for you, understanding how much inventory you're buying and why, if you have any kind of share capital coming in from members, that's great as well. That would certainly count as equity in our minds. That's part of the co-op's equity, which is all really wonderful to have that sorted out. Knowing very much how much you need to start is absolutely critical. Unfortunately, far too often we see businesses who will borrow money co-ops or businesses who will borrow money to get their enterprise up and running. And before they're ready to open their either literal or virtual doors, they've actually run out of money and they haven't accomplished everything that they needed to accomplish. And this happens sometimes due to unexpected expenses, but sometimes it more often than not happens because they were not as certain about the real cost of what they needed to spend and things turned out to just be more expensive than they thought. And so take your time, because it will really, really, really create a huge barrier to your success if before you can even get started that you don't have enough money, and coming back to your financial institution for more money before you've actually accomplished what you said you were going to accomplish in that first ask it's a really difficult ask to come back for, and it creates a real challenging relationship with your lender. And I'll reiterate, this is both for startup, or if you're an existing co-op and you've been around for a little while, but you're sort of entering sort of a new phase where you're trying something new in terms of a new opportunity for revenue, or you're experiencing a new opportunity for growth. And we think of those, and I certainly do, as almost like mini startup phases, right? Every time the organization goes from doing something well to trying to move on to something new or grow in what they're doing and take on more risk. It's like mini startups. You do the exact same planning process there. So it's really, really important. So think through all those costs very, very clearly, and get as many quotes or invoices as you can on these things. Take pictures of ads you're seeing online. go to auctions if you're looking to buy equipment and see what things are going for, and get a sense. Take your time on these things as much as you can. And then, so that's everything you needed to get started. Your cash flow projections are a critical planning tool, both before you start and then also later as a way of revisiting your how things went in your financials to see how good you were at projecting, how on track you are, and then helping you plan for the future. So what does a cash flow plan look like? Well, it ideally is something that we see as your as a breakdown of your sources of income and revenue. And those are line items out for different sources so that you can see how they each play a role in what you're doing. And then similarly, line items for any kind of cost of goods that you might have if you're dealing with inventory at all. And then your hard expenses that are typically, for the most part, not changing. And so we think of these things as being sort of your income statement, so your income streams, and then your variable costs, things that change. So the more you sell, the more services you provide, the more your variable costs might change. And those can fluctuate together. And then your real hard costs, those expenses like rent and utilities and maybe some wages that don't change much regardless of how busy or how much income you're bringing in. And so we would love to see those not on an annual basis broken out, but actually broken out on a monthly basis over the course of the whole year. And that is really, really important. And so if you think about a simple example of a business or an organization that might be quite seasonal in its income, that if you see a cash flow projection, that shows you just the year end, the annual totals, it doesn't show you that seasonality. And so you might see a cash flow projection that shows a net income that's positive at the end of the year, which is wonderful. But if it doesn't show their seasonality there, say in January and February and March, potentially, let's say if you're, I'll give an example of, say, an organization that's selling product at a farmer's market on quite a regular basis. Well, you're going to see a lot of seasonality there. Farmer's market's really busy in the spring and summer, slow down a bit in the fall, and really slow down in the winter months. And so how does that affect your cash flow? You might be positive by the end of your calendar year, but if you don't have enough cash on hand to get through those months where you might actually be seeing incremental negative months, then the planning effort was fruitless because you didn't actually plan for those downturns. So this is where we actually think back to one of those first questions about how much money might you ask for? That was one of our first questions. And we said, well, we want to be really specific. And we don't want to just say it'd be nice to have a little extra money just for a rainy day. But once you've completed your cash flow projections on that monthly basis, if you do see some seasonality in your business, that can create a really clear indication of what specific ask you might have for working capital, for extra access to cash to cover you through those slower months. And so if it's a few months in the winter where, let's say, you're short $5,000 or $6,000 at the end of each month, and then things start to ramp back up again in the spring and you get cash flow positive again, well, that's a really good indication that maybe having access to a $15,000 line of credit is exactly what your organization needs. And there's evidence for it because you've shown it in your cash flow projections. That's really great. Another reason for doing cash flow projections is that you may not see a direct negative without breaking down the month over month if your income is coming in on a delayed basis. So if you're selling, for instance, to larger wholesalers a product, they might actually have 90-day payment terms or somewhere in between 0 and 90 days. And so you might have a really good month in June of selling product to your wholesaler who's buying lots from you, but they're not going to pay you until mid-August. So from a cash flow perspective, you really want to be able to identify when the cash is coming in and when the cash is going out, because you might need to spend a lot of money just to get all that inventory, to cover some wages and costs of rent, and not to see that income come in for a couple months means, again, you might need to do some cash flow planning around having access to something like a line of credit to cover you for that. So in that case, where where a big source of your income might be delayed by a month or 2 or even 3, it's very, very common then to have a line of credit covering about roughly how much income you're getting over the course of 2 or 3 months. So it really helps you get through those ebbs and those flows. So those are all really, really important ways of addressing seasonality. And then we also want to think about, especially if you're in the early stages or startup stages of your organization, developing a few scenarios on your cash flow. And so we want to have a conservative, a realistic, and maybe even an aggressive. I would say that in order of most importance, it's in that order, actually, that having a conservative cash flow projection is probably the most important. So it's another way to think about it would be a pessimistic cash flow projection. What are things going to look like if they don't go as well as we hoped? And what that allows you to do is it allows you to plan for sort of the worst case scenario, so to speak. What if sales are way worse than we expected? Or what if we're just slow to start? What if we have bad weather? What that affects our business? All those things that contribute to having lower income. What does that look like? What you want to do in that conservative cash flow projection is obviously create a scenario where income is significantly less based on some of those factors. And then ideally that will dial down what we talked about a moment ago is your variable expenses, things that change with how much you're selling. And then looking at your fixed expenses, is there anything in there that, you might have thought is fixed, but in a real emergency situation, could you remove as saying those were nice to haves, for instance? What could we do differently, right? And so maybe that's reducing how much you spend on labor. In certain scenarios, it actually might mean that you don't rent a commercial space like an office space or a storefront because you found that actually if things aren't going well, that these things can be run more virtually and out of folks' homes. And so those costs can maybe be removed as well. What you end up with when you're done with that conservative cash flow statement is a very near example of what sometimes is referred to as a break-even analysis too. It shows you like, what is the real break-even point here for us? And anything less than that, we actually can't even pay the bills anymore. We can't keep the sort of proverbial lights on anymore. And that, aside from obviously being really problematic, helps set like a real floor for you and the other folks that are doing the planning for, what's the bare minimum we need to do here to be successful. And then making sure that that is, of course, quite realistic still, that you feel very, very confident that at the very least that you should be able to stay above that floor of income and that you have all good reasons to think that. And how do you do that? Well, when you're putting together your sales projections, we've talked a lot about costs and making sure that you've really identified your startup and your ongoing costs and you've nailed down those numbers as accurately as you can. But you might be sitting there thinking, how in the world do we project sales if we're just starting or we're really early stage? We haven't done it yet. We just don't know. And the reality is that is the hardest part of all of this. And so my advice is think of your sales and revenue projections as being a best educated guess, not just a best guess, but an educated guess, meaning that you've taken in as much information or data as you possibly can to understand what is a realistic sales projection. I'm going to give you a funny example, but one I love. And it was quite a long time ago now. It was probably 10 years ago. We were working with some folks that were starting a cafe. And this cafe was in a neighborhood in Vancouver that is known as Gastown. And it's a popular neighborhood, which is great. And they were putting together their cash flow projections for the cafe. And they wanted to think about, like, how do we know how much we're going to sell? Like, what's realistic here? And you might imagine that if you and I, we're all talking about a coffee shop right now, you might say, well, do you have any really good guess around how much coffee a cafe sells? Like, are they selling 100 coffees and Americanos a day, or is it 600? Like, what is realistic here? And so what they did, which I thought was quite ingenious because it shows some ingenuity as well as just the fact that doing something is better than nothing. They took turns going down to a cafe that was in the neighborhood that they were going to open in, just a few blocks away. And they went down there every morning for a week and every afternoon for that same week, and around closing time again for an hour at each point. And they just stood there with a clipboard and made a note with every single person that left the cafe, what they left with. Did they leave with a coffee? Did they leave with a coffee and a muffin or a sandwich and a cold drink? And they tabulated that out and took an average, and they used those figures to project what their sales might look like. It's not a perfect science, but it is way better than a random guess. And it allows us to know that they put some effort into thinking through that. This is also where your expertise might come into real play. So if the area that you're doing work in with your co-op is somewhere where you've had considerable experience before, then you might just innately have a really good sense about what's realistic for you to do as an organization in terms of revenue. And if you can back that up just by showing your credentials, and by credentials I mean just like you've had that experience before, and that you're a reliable source, that's also a fantastic way to put together your cash flow projections. So really good. Okay, moving on. I did linger there a bit because that's really important. Kyle, do we have any questions?
We do have a question.
Great.
Brendan asks, so conservative cash flow plans goal is one that would hit the break-even point?
It doesn't have to specifically, but I would say that's sort of the ballpark you want to be in. So it doesn't have to work out exactly. We actually we use a different tool to do a break even specifically, where you actually can do a quick calculation, and you can find break even calculators online. They're all over the place, where you can literally put in a few pieces of information and it will calculate your break even for you. You don't have to do that though, especially if you think that the break even point is so much lower than what you even think is being a conservative. That's fine. You don't have to do that. But if you want to play with a break-even calculator at the same time and just see where that is, it's a good exercise actually. And so when you find a break-even calculator online, what it'll do is if you can imagine there being basically three variables. There's your fixed expenses, things that never change, even if you sell nothing in an entire month, those expenses are still there and you still have to pay for them. So that's kind of like your baseline. And then you are basically then working with two other variables, which is your income, your revenue, and your variable costs to achieve that income. So for every item you sell or service you provide, there's sometimes and often a cost just to doing that one thing or those 10 things. And so those two together, they basically give you your profit margin, really. And so when you use that little bit there, you realize, okay, well, if my fixed costs are $100 a month and I'm selling things for $10, I don't actually need to sell 10 items to break even. I need to sell more if I have a variable cost in there of, let's just say, $3. So it'll factor those three variables together and figure that out for you. But great question. Yeah, doesn't have to be the exact same thing, but to do those two exercises together is probably a good idea. Helps put you on good footing. Yeah. Awesome. Any others, Kyle?
Another great question, a bit of a follow-up. Could it be possible to receive funding for a model that may spend an additional time period in the red?
Yeah, for sure. And that's to be expected, frankly. I would say that if I see cash flow projections for a startup organization that shows that they're going to be in the black immediately, I immediately assume that's optimistic. So yes. Now, what's a good rule of thumb? I would say, at least for some more flexible startup programs, my personal experience has been that programs like Vancity's microloan startup business financing program for businesses, co-ops, or I absolutely don't want to speak for the folks from Community Futures on here, so I won't, but they do great work in the same area. But in my personal experience, I would say operating at a loss throughout the first year is probably sort of the point at which, if you're planning to operate at a loss until the end of the first year, and then after that really start to turn the corner, that's probably the longest we'd want to see in terms of planning to operate at a loss. Anything longer than that would be probably too long, in that it just gets to be so far away that, the difference between 1 month and 6 months starts to lose meaning at that point for when you're really going to achieve your break even. So a shorter time frame just makes it easier for us through analysis to understand whether or not it's achievable for you. And it also, of course, reduces how much capital you need to cover those costs. It just starts to add up way too fast if you get longer than that. So 6 months would be great. 3 months would be wonderful. A year would be pushing it, but in the right scenario, it's maybe possible. What is often true, though, coming back to seasonality, is often true that businesses and co-ops and even not-for-profit social enterprises will operate at a loss for several months, and then they'll start to see months where things become positive. But then due to seasonality, they might pop back into the red again. So when they finish the first year, they're in the red. But there were months in there where they were not in the red. And that would be really nice to see as well, as a realistic projection that's possible. If it's impossible to get out of the red for the first year, it's just a lot of debt to carry. Usually that's the trick, or the tricky part. Yeah. Okay. Now, moving along, we're running a little low on time, Kyle. I'm sorry we've gone slow. So I'm going to go fast because we've covered some of the really important stuff. You want to make sure you have a contingency plan, folks. So when you're this kind of work can be done both in your business plan, but also in your cash flow planning as well, really. And so really thinking about things that are both in your control, but especially things that are out of your control that are risks to your operations and your success and what they might be, and then ideally how you might deal with them, right? So for some businesses and organizations, the current political climate in your area might play a really big role in what you can and cannot do. Not a great example, but one that was top of mind the other day for me was a bunch of folks that have been running Airbnbs in British Columbia. In a lot of communities are finding that that's just not viable anymore because the government is clamping down on them. And so, not that I'm a big supporter of that business model, but certainly was always a risk for folks doing that. And so good thing to be mindful of. And so thinking through, like, how will you really work through these challenges when they come up? What will be your plan? What you might find is it's things that you really hope won't happen, but you need to be able to deal with it. What happens if you're a key person in the organization running it every day, or maybe you're even working in the organization every day? What if you get sick for 4 weeks and can't go to work? And without your expertise, can the organization, the business keep running? What if wages go up by 10% due to a minimum wage increase or something similar? I'm on the board of a not-for-profit childcare organization, and we have a bunch of early childcare educators, and we're very much planning to increase wages constantly, but it's a big factor in our planning for sure. You might import, and so importing in the Canadian dollar versus the American dollar or other international exchange rates might play a big factor in that. So factoring that into your planning could be really important when you're doing conservative cash flow plan, as well as you're realistic, or just if it's not necessarily directly related to your income, then in your business planning as well. Your security, when you're looking for financing, security is tangible assets, things that the co-op owns or will own with the loan funds that have value and that could potentially be resold or and then used to repay that loan in part. And so good to just know if you have any of that to bring to the table. It's not uncommon to have very little, though, in a startup organization, and that's okay. And to be fair, often, especially in a startup or an early stage organization, things like inventory, in my personal opinion, they don't actually provide a tremendous amount of value, for the simple fact that if you're not selling your inventory through your normal course of business, then the likelihood of being able to sell a whole bunch of it at once, even at a massive discount to repay your loan, is very challenging. And so inventory is a tricky one. You very likely don't own any real estate, so that can be really hard as well. What's probably more likely is that you might have some equipment that you're purchasing, especially if that's what the purpose of the loan funds were for. And so that can be a really important factor in how much a lender might be able to get you qualified for or approved for, is if you're buying equipment. And we say cash too, but it's very unlikely there. The co-op might have some member equity that it's hanging on to, but it's probably not going to be a huge factor in this. So just knowing that security is relevant, but probably not a huge factor for a lot of the early stage organizations. The last thing, though, is personal guarantees. And this is a big, kind of a challenging area for co-ops. And know that it's something that we wrestle with internally, at least at Vancity, which is whether or not a co-op, the members of the co-op and the board would need to provide personal guarantees. If you are in startup mode, meaning that you have absolutely no track record, the likelihood of requiring personal guarantees, at least from Vancity, even our more flexible microloan startup business program, it's still pretty likely that we would ask for personal guarantees. What we have been able to do in the past is make those personal guarantees limited, which means that if it's I'll make up a number, $50,000 loan, and and there's 5 members to start, that each member might provide a personal guarantee of $10,000. What that means is that you are basically signing on to say that if this all goes sideways and we have to shut down and are unable to repay our loan, that we've each promised in our personal capacity, not immediately, but probably basically in the means of transferring the loan into your personal name, will make good on that loan. That's not something that is as easy to facilitate for co-ops, I understand. And so we've tried to be creative about that wherever we can. And what we also try to do is find a way that as the co-op grows, both in terms of its operations and its income, but also especially in terms of its membership, that we find ways to move away from personal guarantees as much as possible. Because I certainly know it's not very democratic to have 5 or 6 people offer personal guarantees in a co-op that has 50 members, if only 5 of them have personal guarantees. That you start to degrade the cooperative model right there. So it can become tricky. But in the early stages where the membership are very active in the organization and are very personally invested, at least in terms of their commitment, that can be something that we look for. Okay, the marketplace. I've actually touched on this quite a lot already, so I'm going to go quickly. But knowing very articulately who your customers and your competitors are, as well as your suppliers, really, really important. Building out a cash flow plan based on a marketplace where you might say that, the global market for our product or service is $6 billion a year. And if we can earn just 1% of that, we will be absolutely fine. That's not a good way to address the marketplace. So not only in the examples I gave earlier, but based on whether or not you're sort of more virtual and have a larger marketplace across the country or even internationally, versus somewhere that you're more geographically located by a local-based community service or product. That's number one. But number two is think about it in the reverse. Like, who is really going to buy your product or service or pay for what you're doing? And what is the reality of how large that market is? And who are you competing against, right? Because the moment you start saying that your marketplace is even bigger, then the competition just gets bigger as well. And so I would argue, not always, but for so many organizations, even if you're a service-based that could do virtual service, that the folks that are going to know about you and want to work with you are more likely to be a little bit more local. And by a little bit, what I mean is it may be very much within your city or your town, or at least in your province, is probably more likely to start. That's how you're going to get more traction when you're out there pounding the pavement virtually and in real life to get the word out. That's how word of mouth is going to work. And so probably being more realistic about your marketplace being a little bit closer to home to start is probably more realistic, my sense would be, or at least is a good starting place. Yeah. And then from that to understanding the market demand, what is realistic as well too. Saying that everybody needs to buy shoes because we're selling shoes, and so the market demand is going to be huge. Sounds great, but let's be honest, there is 1,000,001 places to get shoes nowadays, and so your market demand is going to be limited. And then what is it that makes you different, right? Your market differentiator is a huge factor in whether or not there's going to be demand for what you are doing or what you are selling. And so think through really clearly about that and try to be realistic about your own personal choices in your life, about where you spend money and what you do and why you're making those choices and how that might reflect back on folks that you're working with. Many of these things we've talked about today, I want to remind folks that you're going to probably get a whole bunch of positive feedback from the other folks that are working with you in your co-op, that are, when you come up with ideas or you're putting together your business plan and your financial projections, you're going to get a lot of positive feedback. You're going to get a lot of positive feedback from your friends and family who want to be nice and want to see you succeed. And so what you want to really seek out is as much honest and critical feedback on these things as you can around what people would really do, right? Maybe not a great example, but my niece is working with her class to raise a bunch of money for a school trip. They've got about 6 or 7 different fundraisers, and they assume that Uncle Brian is good basically for every one of those to buy something. And in reality, if it wasn't my niece, I would not be purchasing any of these things. And so what is her market for selling coupon books or yard services? It's pretty small once she gets out of family and friends. There's not that many people interested anymore once they don't know who the person doing the selling is. So really, really narrow in on some critical thinking there. And to help you with that, number 10 is third-party advice. Okay, so getting honest feedback from people who are not emotionally invested, as I just said, but also getting critical help around putting these things together. This is where a lot of what we talked about today comes together a little bit in saying you need advisors, right? So those advisors that maybe say are helping you in the area of finance where you're maybe not your strong suit, ideally they're there now helping you with your cash flow projections and your financial planning, as well as your business planning or thinking through your market conditions. Don't be afraid to seek out advice from folks that are already doing exactly what you're doing, whether it's a cooperative model or a private business. As long as you're not directly competing with them, then they might be really willing to help, especially pick up the phone and call somebody that's in a different jurisdiction than you and say, we're looking to do something similar and want some advice. And I think you'd be surprised how often you might get some really good advice. It may only be 3-4 minute conversation because people are busy, but you can learn a lot real fast from getting third-party advice. And so seek it out as much as you possibly can. It's a good excuse to slow down a bit, which I think is also really important. So I would encourage you to do that as much as you can. Okay. We were hoping to leave some time at the end for feedback. I'm sorry. We have less time than I'd hoped, or not feedback, sorry, for questions, but let's dive into that now, Kyle, while we have time. And know that when the clock strikes the hour, wherever you are, I am not going to hang up. I'll hang around for those that want to hang around.
Fantastic. That was really, really great, Brian. I mean, really tremendous tips in there for anybody who's starting a business or working with folks starting a business. I don't see any other questions in the chat, so maybe we'll just put out a quick call. Does anybody have a question for Brian?
Is that Derek? Is that right? I saw a hand up, go up and down.
I think that was a clap.
Oh, a clap. Sorry. Oh, thank you very much. I'll take the
virtual
clap.
Applause. Yeah.
I see your chat. Thanks, Georgina.
Oh,
or Georgia. Sorry.
Here's a good question from Augustina. What if the owners of the cooperative or startup business are municipalities? Would it be the same structure?
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So I would say, yeah, there would not be a huge difference there, except for the fact that it would almost certainly negate the ability to take any kind of guarantees, I would imagine. And we talked about personal guarantees earlier. There is a thing called corporate guarantees where instead of individuals giving up their promise to repay, it's companies that are in support of another company. Gets a little bit more complicated. If it's a municipality, I would venture to guess that's absolutely not on the table, that a municipality would probably not be willing to sign off on that necessarily, which just means then that your lender needs to feel super duper confident in the business plan and the cash flow projections and maybe some of the security that you're putting forward. Now, if I'm wrong about that, if the municipalities involved are willing to guarantee that loan, then actually it can go the other way, and that provides an extremely strong guarantee against the loan, and then that would be great. So it depending on which way that goes, I would say it just changes the risk framework, and really keep in mind that from a lender's point of view, we are risk averse, and that without any form of what we would call like personal guarantees, that just means that an organization, cooperative, or a small business that incorporated, if it itself kind of ceases operations, shuts down, dissolves as a legal entity, and effectively declares itself bankrupt, without personal guarantees or other guarantees from other organizations, that means the entire remaining debt is just a complete write-off for that credit union or the lender. And that is a significant loss, right? Like banks and credit unions take losses on loans regularly, but they are mitigated losses, meaning that it is not the full amount that we typically take a loss on because of guarantees or assets that are security. And so with startup financing, that is why the very first question on the slide that said, is it more challenging for a startup without 2 years of track record to get a loan? Yeah, because if things don't work out, there's usually not a lot left there, which means that 100% of the outstanding debt is often written off, which is a lot. Yeah. More questions there.
Yeah, we have a good question here from Taz. What would be your advice for co-ops that are not legally a nonprofit, but would effectively be operating as one?
So correct me if I'm wrong here, Kyle, but in most provinces, like when you incorporate, you're incorporating as either a community service co-op or just a co-op, meaning that you're actually, you're for the profit of the members, so to speak, right? that right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. Honestly, we wouldn't look at it a whole lot differently, frankly. We would really be looking at the viability of what's being undertaken. That would be it. I don't want to become now a broken record talking about personal guarantees. That's, but to be fair, that's probably the only difference that we would look at there, is that if it was, if I was starting a co-op with a group of people that was very much going to be a not-for-profit co-op, or at least act like one, I would probably be much less willing to put down a personal guarantee. Not that I expect to profit from a normal co-op, but there's probably more likelihood, like if it's a worker co-op, then you're more invested in seeing that succeed, because it might be tied to your livelihood down the road as being an employee. Where a not-for-profit co-op is very unlikely. And so it just changes the risk profile is what it really does. And so it just means that how much risk the lender is willing to take will change very likely. But not the co-op expert, but from my experience checking with Kyle, if you're going to be nearly operating as a not-for-profit co-op, you might just want to incorporate as a community service co-op to just really clearly define that line. Yeah.
Maybe one more question. We'll finish with this one from Brendan. What are your thoughts on lending to someone who's looking to purchase a pre-existing business that's been in business for 10 years or more? What does getting a loan for something like that look like?
Yeah, that's great. So it looks surprisingly similar in that, you're kind of in this, you're on the edge between the startup early stage financing that's based very much on everything we talked about today, as a way of shoring up the fact that the business didn't exist before and there is no track record. You're on the fence between that and an existing business that has tremendous experience to basically service the debt, we call it, meaning when we say service the debt, that just means there's enough money every month left over after everything else to pay for the loan payment, that if you can service the debt based on historical financial records, that's also great. When you're buying a business, though, the relationship there is just a little bit more gray, because whoever's taking over the operations may not come in with the same skill set, and so the assurance that you can continue to generate that same revenue isn't as solid. Or it may be that the business wasn't actually earning enough income, and there wasn't enough net income left over to service the debt based on historical records. And so therefore it actually feels more like kind of this growthy kind of loan, where you're saying, listen, we're going to do new things that are going to make us better, and we're going to borrow money to do it, and that's going to make us better off, and then we'll be able to pay the loan. So that's why it's a bit of a grayer, but otherwise not a whole lot different. Augustina, we would very much though like to see the financial records of that other company. That would be great. And I will maybe make one last plug. It may not be perfectly aligned with what you're doing, Augustina, but there's a great group for those of you maybe more in Western Canada called Scale Collaborative, who are also working very hard with organizations to buy existing community assets. And they use that term broadly as basically like businesses or organizations in communities that if they were lost would be a real detriment to the community. And community ownership is a great model to save some of those businesses and organizations. And so they're there to help as well, which is great. Yeah, if there's any more, I think there might be a couple more questions, Kyle, but if you want to wrap up, I'm also happy to hang on and just linger after.
For sure. Yeah, I guess thank you so much, Brian, for joining us today. I think the insights you shared are really fantastic for anyone starting a business, supporting businesses. I learned lots. Great for our work. And then thanks everybody for coming out. If you need to dash, feel free to, but if you have some additional questions for Brian, feel free to stick around. We'll also share the recording of the webinar, as well as a link to the Biz Plan Generator and some other fun resources afterwards. But do sign up for our newsletters, and that way you can learn about all the upcoming webinars that we've got coming down the pipe. Thanks so much, and have a great rest of your day.